"Get out of my house," Linda Harper said, her voice sharp enough to cut through the thunder outside, and the words hung in the air for a second that seemed to stretch forever before 15-year-old Daniel Harper realized she meant it. The storm had rolled into the small Ohio town just after sunset, dark clouds pressing low over the quiet streets, rain hitting the roof of the Harper house in heavy, steady waves that rattled the gutters and blurred the porch light into a pale yellow halo. Inside the living room, the smell of wet earth drifted in through the half-open window, while Daniel stood near the doorway, his sneakers leaving faint damp prints on the hardwood floor. A few minutes earlier, he had been finishing his homework at the kitchen table, the same table where he used to sit with his father on Saturday mornings eating pancakes and talking about baseball. Now the house felt different, colder somehow, like the familiar walls had quietly decided they no longer belonged to him. Linda stood with her arms folded tightly across her chest, her expression fixed in the kind of calm certainty that left no room for questions. She had just finished explaining that money had disappeared from her wallet earlier that evening. She said she had seen Daniel near the bedroom hallway. She said she knew what that meant. Daniel tried to speak, but the words stumbled in his throat because the accusation made no sense. He had never taken anything from anyone in his life, not even when friends at school joked about slipping candy into their pockets at the gas station down the road. Across the room, his father, Robert Harper, stood beside the coat rack near the front door, his face unreadable. Robert was a quiet man who worked long shifts at the local auto parts warehouse, a man who usually listened before deciding anything. But tonight he looked tired, older than Daniel remembered, his shoulders slightly slumped as the wind rattled the windows. Linda's voice cut through the silence again, calm but firm, repeating the same words that had frozen Daniel in place. "He needs to leave, Robert. I will not have a thief living under this roof." Daniel turned toward his father, waiting for him to say something, anything, that would stop the moment from sliding into something final. For a few seconds, the only sound in the room was the rain drumming against the siding and the distant growl of thunder rolling across the fields beyond town. Then Robert walked to the door. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't argue. He simply opened it. Cold wind rushed into the hallway, carrying the smell of wet pavement and autumn leaves, and Daniel felt the chill immediately against his face. The porch light flickered as the storm intensified, and the world outside looked blurred and uncertain through the sheet of rain. Daniel's backpack was still hanging on the back of a kitchen chair. His jacket was upstairs in his room. None of that seemed to matter anymore. Linda stood perfectly still, watching him with an expression that never changed. Robert kept the door open, his hand resting against the frame. The message was clear without another word. Daniel stepped forward slowly, the wooden floor creaking softly beneath his feet. For a moment he looked back at the house that had been his home since he was 8 years old, the hallway where he used to race toy cars along the baseboards, the staircase where Christmas lights had once been wrapped around the railing, the kitchen where laughter used to fill the space on weekends. Now it was silent. He crossed the threshold and stepped onto the porch. Rain soaked his sweatshirt almost instantly, cold drops running down his neck as the wind pushed against him. Behind him, the door closed with a solid, quiet click that sounded far louder than it should have. Daniel stood there for a second under the flickering porch light, staring out at the empty street where water streamed along the curb. At 15 years old, in the middle of a storm that rattled the trees and bent the street signs, Daniel Harper realized something simple and terrifying at the same time. The place he had called home was no longer his. Daniel Harper did not move right away after the door closed behind him. The porch light flickered above his head while the rain kept falling in thick, steady lines that turned the driveway into a shining sheet of water. For a moment he simply stood there, listening to the storm and trying to understand how quickly everything had changed. Inside that house were the only rooms he had known for the past 7 years. Inside that house were his school books, his winter jacket, the baseball glove his father had given him on his 12th birthday, and the small model car he had been building for almost 3 weeks. Now the house looked strangely distant even though it was only a few feet behind him. The warm yellow light from the living room window blurred through the rain, and Daniel could see the faint shadow of someone moving past the curtain. He did not know if it was Linda or his father. The thought that his father might still be standing there, silent and unmoving, hurt more than the cold wind pressing against his back. Daniel slowly stepped down from the porch and walked toward the street. Water splashed under his sneakers with every step, soaking through the thin fabric until his socks felt heavy and cold. The wind pushed against him from the north, bending the tall maple trees that lined the quiet road. This part of town was usually peaceful after dark. Most of the houses were small and modest, with narrow driveways and old pickup trucks parked under carports. On a normal evening, lights would glow warmly behind curtains, and the sound of televisions would drift through open windows. Tonight the storm had driven everyone inside. The streets were empty. Daniel walked without any clear direction, keeping his head slightly down as rain ran across his forehead and into his eyes. He told himself that if he kept moving long enough, he might figure out what to do next. His mind kept replaying the moment inside the living room. Linda standing with her arms crossed. The calm certainty in her voice. The way she said the word thief as if it had already been proven beyond doubt. Daniel tried to remember if there had been any moment when his father looked uncertain, any moment when Robert Harper might have stopped the accusation before it turned into something permanent. But the memory would not change. His father had opened the door. That was the only decision that mattered. After several minutes, Daniel reached the corner where the narrow residential street met the two-lane highway that cut through town. The traffic light at the intersection blinked yellow in the rain, casting dull reflections across the wet asphalt. A single car passed slowly, tires hissing on the pavement, and then the road was quiet again. Across the highway stood a small gas station with a faded blue sign that glowed dimly through the storm. The station was closed for the night, the pumps dark and the windows covered with metal security grates. Daniel crossed the empty road carefully, the wind tugging at his sweatshirt as he reached the small concrete awning that stretched over the front of the building. The overhang blocked most of the rain, leaving a narrow dry strip along the wall. Daniel sat down on the cool concrete with his back against the brick surface and pulled his knees closer to his chest. The storm continued to rumble across the sky, thunder rolling somewhere beyond the dark fields outside town. From where he sat he could see the faint glow of the streetlights and the long ribbon of highway disappearing into the distance. It occurred to him then that he had nowhere to go. No friend close enough to reach on foot. No family member who would open a door at this hour without questions. The realization settled quietly in his chest, heavy but strangely clear. Daniel Harper was 15 years old, sitting under the awning of a closed gas station in the middle of a storm, wearing damp clothes and carrying nothing except the thoughts in his head. The rain continued to fall, steady and patient, as the small town around him slept. The rain continued long after midnight, falling in a steady rhythm that echoed softly off the metal awning above Daniel Harper. The small strip of concrete beneath the gas station overhang had become his temporary shelter, a narrow island of dryness surrounded by dark pavement shining under distant streetlights. Daniel kept his knees pulled close to his chest, his damp sweatshirt clinging to his arms while the night air grew colder with each passing hour. Every few minutes a gust of wind pushed a spray of rain under the awning, forcing him to shift slightly closer to the brick wall behind him. The town looked different from where he sat. During the day, this intersection was usually busy with pickup trucks, delivery vans, and parents driving their children to school. Now the road stretched empty in both directions, reflecting the pale glow of traffic lights that blinked steadily above the silent highway. Daniel had never noticed how quiet the town could become after midnight. The silence gave him too much time to think. His thoughts kept returning to the same moment inside the living room. Linda Harper standing with absolute certainty in her voice. The accusation spoken as if it were already proven beyond question. Daniel replayed the scene again and again, searching for something he might have missed. He tried to remember every detail from that evening before the argument began. After school, he had gone straight home, dropped his backpack near the kitchen table, and finished the math assignment that was due the next morning. Later, he had poured a glass of milk and watched the rain begin outside the window while the weather report on the television warned about a strong storm system moving through the county. Nothing unusual had happened. Nothing that could explain why Linda suddenly claimed money was missing. Daniel closed his eyes for a moment, listening to the steady sound of rain against the pavement. The thought that troubled him most was not the accusation itself. It was how quickly everything had escalated. Linda had not asked questions. She had not searched the house or waited to see if the money might appear somewhere else. Instead, she had gone straight to his father with certainty already in her voice. The memory felt strangely deliberate, as if the conclusion had existed long before the accusation was spoken. Daniel slowly opened his eyes again and looked out across the empty highway. A pair of headlights appeared in the distance, growing brighter as a large truck rolled through the intersection and disappeared toward the far edge of town. The tires made a low rushing sound on the wet road before fading into silence again. Daniel realized then that hours had passed since he left the house. The storm had begun to weaken, the rain now lighter than before, though the wind still moved steadily through the trees along the roadside. His clothes were no longer dripping, but they remained cold and heavy against his skin. He rubbed his hands together slowly, trying to warm his fingers. Somewhere far away a train horn sounded, long and low across the dark countryside. Daniel had heard that sound many times before while lying in his bedroom at night. It always seemed distant and unimportant then. Tonight it reminded him how large the world outside town really was. He wondered what would happen when morning came. People would drive past this gas station on their way to work. The diner down the road would open for breakfast. School buses would appear along the highway carrying students who were probably still asleep in their beds right now. Daniel imagined the familiar yellow bus stopping near his street while the driver waited for children to climb aboard. For the first time in years, he would not be one of them. The realization settled slowly into his mind. Whatever happened next, the life he had known yesterday was already gone. Daniel Harper was still sitting under the quiet awning of a closed gas station while the last of the storm drifted across the Ohio sky, but somewhere deep inside, he began to understand that the night had not only taken away his home. It had also pushed him into a future he had never expected. The sky had begun to lighten slightly by the time the rain finally slowed to a thin mist. Daniel Harper noticed it first as a faint gray glow above the distant tree line beyond the highway. The storm clouds that had filled the night were drifting eastward, leaving behind a quiet stillness that felt almost unreal after hours of wind and rain. The pavement around the gas station was covered with shallow pools of water that reflected the pale light of the early morning sky. Daniel had not slept. He had tried closing his eyes several times, leaning his head against the brick wall, but the cold concrete beneath him and the unfamiliar weight of the night kept his mind awake. Instead, he watched the slow return of morning. The blinking traffic light at the intersection changed its rhythm as the town began to wake. Somewhere nearby a screen door opened and closed. A truck engine started in the distance. These small sounds felt strangely loud after the long silence of the storm. Daniel slowly stretched his stiff legs and stood up from the ground. His clothes had dried slightly, but they still carried the heavy dampness of the night. When he stepped out from beneath the awning, the cool air of early morning brushed against his face. The clouds were breaking apart now, revealing thin lines of pale blue between them. He could smell wet asphalt and fresh soil from the nearby fields. For a moment he stood there looking back toward the residential street where his house stood only a few blocks away. It would be easy to walk back. The distance was short enough that he could reach the front porch in less than 10 minutes. The thought lingered in his mind longer than he expected. Part of him imagined knocking on the door and hearing his father open it again. Perhaps the anger from the night before had faded. Perhaps the accusation had been reconsidered. Perhaps Linda had discovered the missing money somewhere else in the house. The possibility seemed small, but it still hovered quietly in his thoughts. Daniel looked down at the wet pavement and shook his head slowly. Something about the way the door had closed behind him felt final. There had been no hesitation in Linda Harper's voice and no resistance in his father's actions. Returning now would only repeat the same moment all over again. The realization settled into him with a calm clarity that surprised him. Daniel Harper turned away from the direction of his old street and began walking along the edge of the highway instead. Morning traffic had not yet fully begun, but a few early drivers were already passing through the intersection. A delivery van rolled by and the driver glanced briefly toward the gas station before continuing down the road. Daniel kept his hands tucked into the pockets of his damp sweatshirt as he walked. The air felt cooler than the night before, but the steady movement helped warm his body. After a few minutes, he noticed the small garage across the road from the gas station. It was a modest building with 2 wide service bays and a faded wooden sign that read Green Auto Repair. The metal doors were still closed, but a single light glowed inside the office window. Daniel had seen the place many times before while riding in his father's truck through town. It was the kind of shop where older cars often sat parked outside waiting for repairs, and where the smell of motor oil drifted into the street during the day. As he slowed his steps near the edge of the gravel lot, the front door of the garage opened. A tall older man stepped outside carrying a steaming coffee mug in one hand. He paused on the small concrete step and looked across the quiet road. For a brief moment, his eyes settled on Daniel standing there with damp clothes and tired posture beneath the pale morning sky. The man tilted his head slightly as if trying to understand the story behind what he was seeing. Then he raised one hand in a simple greeting. Daniel hesitated for a second before lifting his own hand in return. Neither of them spoke yet, but the calm stillness of that early morning moment made it clear that the long night Daniel had endured was about to lead him somewhere he had not expected. The older man from the garage studied Daniel Harper for a few seconds before taking a slow sip from his coffee mug. The early morning air still carried the cool dampness left behind by the storm, and the gravel lot in front of Green Auto Repair glistened with scattered puddles that reflected the pale light of the rising sun. Daniel stood near the edge of the lot with his hands tucked deep into the pockets of his damp sweatshirt, unsure whether he should continue walking or remain where he was. The man set his coffee mug down on the small wooden railing beside the door and stepped off the concrete porch. His movements were calm and unhurried, the kind of quiet confidence that came from years of routine. When he reached the edge of the gravel driveway, he spoke in a steady voice that carried easily across the short distance. "Good morning there, son." That was all he said at first, but the words held none of the suspicion Daniel had grown used to hearing from adults who thought something was wrong. Daniel nodded slightly in return. "Good morning, sir." The man looked at Daniel more closely now, noticing the damp clothes, the tired eyes, and the way the boy shifted his weight slightly from one foot to the other, as if unsure whether he was welcome to remain. The man folded his arms loosely and glanced toward the gas station across the road before looking back at Daniel again. "That storm last night was a rough one," he said. "You been out here since it started?" Daniel hesitated before answering. "Yes, sir." The man gave a small nod, as if the answer confirmed something he had already guessed. "Well, that explains the look of those shoes." He gestured toward Daniel's sneakers, still dark with water from the long night. The man then extended his hand toward the building behind him. "My name is Harold Green. I run the shop." Daniel shook the offered hand, surprised by the simple gesture. "Daniel Harper," he replied quietly. Harold Green studied the boy for another moment before picking up his coffee mug again. The garage behind him was beginning to fill with the low ticking sounds of cooling engines and metal tools shifting slightly on the workbench inside as the building warmed in the morning air. "You look like you could use a warm place to sit for a few minutes," Harold said. "I just opened up. Coffee is not much good for someone your age, but there is fresh hot chocolate inside if you want it." Daniel did not respond immediately. The offer felt unfamiliar in a way he could not easily explain. Since the night before, every adult voice he had heard carried judgment or final decisions. Harold Green's voice carried neither. It sounded more like someone talking to a neighbor across a fence on a quiet afternoon. Daniel finally nodded once. "Thank you, sir." Harold pushed the front door open wider and stepped aside. The smell of motor oil and clean metal drifted from inside the garage along with the faint warmth of a space heater running near the workbench. Sunlight filtered through the tall windows along the roofline, reflecting off rows of tools carefully arranged along the walls. Daniel stepped inside slowly, feeling the warmth of the room reach him almost immediately. His damp clothes began to feel less heavy as the chill left his arms. Harold Green walked to a small metal counter near the office door and poured steaming hot chocolate from a large thermos into a thick ceramic mug. He slid the mug across the counter toward Daniel without asking another question. Daniel wrapped his hands around the warm mug and felt the heat spread through his fingers. For the first time since the storm began the night before, he felt something steady return to his chest. Outside, the town was beginning its normal morning routine, but inside the quiet garage, the long night that had pushed Daniel out into the storm was quietly leading him toward the first moment of unexpected kindness he had seen since leaving home. Daniel Harper held the warm mug with both hands for a long moment before taking a careful sip. The hot chocolate was simple and slightly sweet, but the warmth traveled through his chest in a way that made the long night feel a little farther away. Harold Green returned to the workbench near the center of the garage and began organizing a row of metal tools as if the morning had already settled into its usual routine. The quiet clink of wrenches against the wooden surface filled the space, while sunlight continued to brighten the tall windows above the service bays. Daniel remained near the counter for a few minutes, unsure whether he should speak or simply finish the drink and leave. Harold did not rush him. After a while, the older man glanced back over his shoulder. "You can sit if you want, son. No need to stand there like a customer waiting in line." Daniel nodded and pulled a small metal stool closer to the counter. The seat was cool but steady beneath him. He rested the mug carefully on the counter and wrapped his hands around it again. Outside, a pickup truck rolled slowly past the garage and disappeared toward the highway. The town was waking up now. Harold wiped his hands on a folded cloth and walked toward the counter. "You go to the high school over on Franklin Street," he said casually. Daniel looked up in mild surprise. "Yes, sir. 10th grade. Harold gave a small nod. "Thought so. I have seen you riding the bus past here before." He leaned against the counter and studied the boy for a moment with calm curiosity rather than judgment. "Something must have gone pretty wrong last night for you to be sitting under a gas station awning during a storm." Daniel stared down at the surface of the counter for a few seconds. He did not feel ready to explain everything, but the silence felt heavier if he said nothing at all. "There was a misunderstanding at home," he said quietly. Harold did not ask for details. Instead, he nodded once, as if the answer was enough for now. "Well, misunderstandings have a way of sorting themselves out eventually. In the meantime, a young man still needs a dry place to stand." He glanced toward the open service bay where an old sedan sat with its hood raised. "I could use an extra pair of hands around here this morning if you are willing to work. Nothing complicated. Sweeping the floor, organizing a few tool drawers, things like that." Daniel looked up again, surprised by the offer. "I can do that," he said quickly. Harold gave a small approving smile. "Good." He handed Daniel a long-handled broom leaning against the wall. "Start with the floor near the back bay. Just push the dust and gravel toward the door and we will clear it out." Daniel stood and walked slowly toward the back of the garage. The broom felt solid in his hands. As he began sweeping the floor, he noticed the simple rhythm of the task. The steady movement across the concrete created a soft scraping sound that blended with the quiet hum of the heater in the corner. Harold returned to the sedan and lifted a wrench from the workbench, occasionally glancing back toward Daniel as if making sure the boy felt comfortable in the space. For the first time since the night before, Daniel felt the weight in his chest begin to ease slightly. The storm had pushed him out into a dark and uncertain night, but now the morning sunlight stretching across the floor of Green Auto Repair felt like the beginning of something steady and unexpected. Daniel Harper continued sweeping the concrete floor of Green Auto Repair while the morning sunlight slowly expanded across the garage. The steady movement of the broom created a quiet rhythm that helped him focus on something simple and clear. Dust and small bits of gravel gathered into a narrow line as he pushed them toward the open service bay door. Outside, the sky had become brighter, and the last traces of the storm were fading into thin streaks of cloud far above the highway. A few cars began passing the shop more frequently now as the town moved into its normal routine. Inside the garage, the sounds of metal tools, soft engine clicks, and the quiet hum of the heater blended together in a calm pattern that felt steady and predictable. Harold Green worked near the raised hood of the old sedan, occasionally tightening a bolt or adjusting a small part while humming softly to himself. After a few minutes, he glanced over at Daniel and nodded with approval. "You handle that broom like someone who has worked before," Harold said. Daniel paused briefly and rested the broom against the wall. "I helped my father clean the garage at home sometimes," he answered. Harold listened to the words, but did not ask anything more about the house Daniel had left behind. Instead, he walked to a wooden cabinet along the back wall and opened one of the drawers. Inside were rows of small metal tools carefully organized in narrow compartments. Harold picked up a small adjustable wrench and returned to the sedan. "Work is easier when everything has its place," he said casually. "That is something you learn after enough years fixing machines." Daniel nodded slightly and resumed sweeping. The simple task felt strangely calming after the long night he had endured. A few minutes later, Harold stepped away from the car and walked toward the small office door. Inside the office, a radio sat on a shelf above a desk covered with repair receipts and small notebooks. Harold turned the dial until a local morning station came through clearly. Soft country music filled the garage, mixing with the smell of motor oil and the warmth of the rising sun. Daniel noticed that the shop felt less empty now. The quiet music and the steady routine gave the space a feeling of normal life returning. Harold returned from the office carrying a folded cloth towel. He handed it to Daniel. "Your hands are probably still cold from the night air," he said. "You can dry them off before you keep working." Daniel wiped his hands slowly and returned the towel. "Thank you, sir." Harold leaned against the workbench and studied the boy with a thoughtful expression. "You know, Daniel, a garage like this does not run on engines alone. It runs on people showing up and doing honest work." He gestured toward the broom and the clean section of floor Daniel had finished. "You already helped more this morning than you might realize." Daniel looked across the shop floor and noticed how the concrete near the service bay now looked clear and organized compared to the dusty area he had started with earlier. The small improvement gave him a quiet sense of accomplishment. Harold walked toward a small refrigerator near the office and opened the door. Inside were a few bottles of water and a container of sandwiches wrapped in paper. He pulled out a sandwich and placed it on the counter near Daniel. "You should eat something before the day gets too far along," Harold said calmly. Daniel hesitated for a moment before taking the sandwich. The smell of fresh bread reminded him that he had not eaten since the afternoon before the storm began. He thanked Harold again and sat on the stool while the older man returned to his work near the sedan. As Daniel took the first bite, he noticed something else that felt different from the night before. The fear and confusion that had followed him through the storm had begun to fade. In its place was the simple realization that this quiet garage, with its warm light and steady routine, might become the first place where his life could begin moving forward again. The morning continued to unfold quietly inside Green Auto Repair as the sunlight climbed higher through the tall windows above the service bays. Daniel Harper finished the sandwich slowly while sitting on the metal stool near the counter, listening to the soft music from the radio and the steady sounds of Harold Green working beneath the raised hood of the sedan. The food warmed his stomach and helped clear the lingering heaviness from the long night. When he finished eating, he folded the paper carefully and placed it beside the mug he had used earlier. Without being asked, he picked up the broom again and continued sweeping the remaining section of the concrete floor near the back wall. The garage felt brighter now. The sunlight spread across the clean floor he had already finished, reflecting faintly off the chrome edges of tools hanging along the wall. Outside, the road had become busier as people began driving toward their jobs in nearby towns. A school bus passed slowly along the highway, its familiar yellow colors standing out against the pale morning sky. Daniel noticed it through the open service bay and paused for a brief moment. For years, that bus had been part of his normal routine. Now it rolled past the garage and disappeared around the corner without him. He watched it go and then returned to sweeping the floor with quiet focus. Harold Green stepped away from the sedan and closed the hood with a soft click. He wiped his hands with the cloth towel and walked across the garage toward the office desk where an old calendar hung beside the wall phone. He glanced at the date and then looked back toward Daniel. School will already be starting in about half an hour, Harold said calmly. Daniel rested the broom against the wall and looked at the floor for a moment before answering. I know, sir. Harold nodded as if he had expected that response. He did not speak again for a few seconds, allowing the quiet hum of the garage to fill the space. Then he walked over to the counter and leaned against it comfortably. You know something, Daniel, he said in a steady voice. Sometimes life pushes a person onto a road they did not plan to travel. That does not always mean the road leads somewhere bad. Daniel listened carefully but did not interrupt. Harold continued speaking with the same calm tone. When I was about your age, I thought I would spend my life working on a farm outside this town. Then one day, I helped a mechanic fix a broken truck engine. That moment changed everything for me. Daniel looked around the garage again, noticing the rows of tools, the lift equipment, and the neat shelves of spare parts that filled the building. Harold followed his gaze and gave a small smile. Machines may look complicated at first, he said, but they respond well to patience and steady hands. Daniel walked toward the workbench where Harold stood and glanced at the collection of wrenches arranged in careful rows. I have never worked on cars before, he admitted. Harold lifted one of the smaller tools and turned it thoughtfully in his hand. Everyone learns the first time somewhere, he said. What matters is whether you are willing to keep learning after that. Outside, the sunlight now reached fully across the gravel lot, and the last damp spots from the storm began to dry beneath the warmth of the morning. Inside the garage, the quiet routine of tools, engines, and steady work created a feeling of stability Daniel had not expected to find so soon after leaving home. As he stood there beside Harold Green, listening to the calm rhythm of the shop, Daniel began to realize that the path opening in front of him might lead to a future very different from the one he had imagined only the night before. The quiet rhythm of the garage continued through the late morning as Daniel Harper stood beside the workbench studying the tools laid out before him. Harold Green moved around the sedan with steady confidence, tightening bolts and adjusting parts with the calm focus of someone who had repeated the same careful process thousands of times over the years. Sunlight now filled the entire shop, casting long, bright shapes across the concrete floor that Daniel had finished sweeping earlier. Outside, the gravel lot had dried almost completely, and the air carried the fresh smell that often followed a heavy storm. Daniel watched Harold work for a while before speaking again. Thank you for letting me stay here this morning, he said quietly. Harold glanced up from the engine and wiped his hands on the cloth towel once more. You earned your place here today, son, he replied in the same steady voice. You worked without complaining, and that already says a lot about a person. Daniel looked down at the floor for a moment, as if considering something important. I do not know where I am supposed to go now, he admitted. The words were simple but honest. Harold rested the wrench on the workbench and leaned against the side of the car. The truth is that life does not always give us a clear map, he said. Sometimes it only shows the next small step in front of us. He nodded toward the broom and the organized floor. This morning your step was simple work. Tomorrow it might be learning something new. Daniel looked around the garage again. The shelves of parts, the organized drawers of tools, and the quiet order of the shop felt steady in a way that reminded him how chaotic the night before had been. Harold walked toward the office and returned with a small notepad and pencil. He wrote something down and then handed the paper to Daniel. This is the phone number for the high school counselor over on Franklin Street, he explained. If you speak with her, she can help figure out what you should do about school and where you might stay for a while. Daniel studied the number carefully before folding the paper and placing it into the pocket of his sweatshirt. Thank you, sir, he said again. Harold nodded once. In the meantime, you are welcome to come back here tomorrow morning if you want to keep helping around the shop. There is always more work to do. Daniel felt a quiet sense of relief settle in his chest when he heard the words. The future was still uncertain, but at least one place in town had opened its door to him. He walked toward the service bay and looked out across the highway where cars continued to pass under the bright afternoon sky. Less than a day earlier, he had stood alone in the storm with nowhere to go and no idea what would happen next. Now he held a small piece of paper with a phone number, a warm memory of kindness, and the possibility of learning something new in the days ahead. Harold returned to the sedan and lifted the hood once again while the radio played softly in the background. Daniel picked up the broom and made one last pass across the clean floor before placing it carefully against the wall where he had first found it. The simple gesture felt important to him. As he stepped outside into the sunlight, he paused near the edge of the gravel lot and looked back at the garage door where Harold Green continued working inside. The shop looked ordinary to anyone passing by on the road, just another small repair place in a quiet American town. But for Daniel Harper, it had already become the place where the long night ended and a new direction quietly began.